Live from the Hua Hin Marriott Resort and Spa, this is the Marriott Breakfast Show
with Andy Curtis.
Surf Radio.
Right then, so it's time to welcome our guest today, who is a gentleman who's been wandering around all over the place in Thailand and has created a podcast. We'll get to that later on. Nick Fordham, good morning to you.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you here. Tell us a little bit what was your journey to get to Thailand? This is one of the things that we like to ask. How did you get here? You live here now, yes?
I live here with my wife, who's a teacher at the Hua Hin International School.
Aha.
This is part of our Asian adventure. We started off in Shanghai about 15 years ago.
Wow.
8 years in Hong Kong. And during the pandemic, like some people, we just sort of thought, gosh, we don't have to be here. We could be anywhere, because people started being able to work remotely and living remotely. And so we looked at some offers, and my wife saw that there was a possibility of teaching in a place called Hua Hin. We didn't know where it was. We said, yes, let's give it a go. She got the job. And so actually we took the job without ever having been in Hua Hin or seeing Hua Hin.
Wow.
And we moved here during the pandemic when it was all a bit of a ghost town. So it was a strange move.
Pleasant surprise, though, presumably.
It was, and particularly when things started opening up, we thought, actually, we've landed in a lovely spot here.
Yeah, it's the place where you could actually stay for a very, very long time, and a lot of expats and retirees do.
Yes.
Do you see much of a future for yourselves here, or are you still just kind of on that adventure and see how it takes you, as it were?
I think yes, no decisions as yet. We'll see how it goes, but we're very pleased that we made the move, and it's a great spot.
It is a beautiful place in Thailand, and as you say, it's not that well known, which I guess is a good thing.
Yes.
It's not got that sort of the stigma of Pattaya or Phuket or all those kind of overused tourist areas, for want of a better expression. My apologies to anyone who loves either of those two cities. Your background, though, is in performing, though, isn't it? You were an actor, if I'm not wrong.
I was an actor, yes. I was an actor for a few years back in the UK.
Right.
A little bit of theatre, a little bit of telly.
Well, what were you in on the television that some of our
I
listeners
was.
might know?
You would see me very, very briefly in an episode of The Bill.
Oh, okay,
Yes.
okay.
I was on The Bill once. Essentially, I was the one who died in the first 2 minutes. So the first ever credit I got from a director when I was on TV was I was a corpse in the first film that I ever filmed on television, and the director said to me, "Cut," and then he said, "Nick, you were marvellous. You were so still."
Well, there's a bit of praise. So, Nick, we were just talking before that last tune about how you got here and your background. So what made you suddenly decide, I'm going to do a podcast?
That's a good question. I'm not quite sure what the answer is. I think it was just I wanted to do something different. I love history. I read history at university. And the story of the Death Railway, the Thai-Burma Railway, I think for anyone who's in Thailand, it's one of the obvious stories to get interested in.
Sure.
But
most people's knowledge of that, though, would purely, presumably, be through the movie, Bridge Over the River Kwai. Bridge on the River Kwai? Over the River Kwai? I can't remember. The one with Alec Guinness in it, anyway.
Yes, 1957 movie. Absolutely. And I think that's really interesting, is that it's one of those things that we all see it through the filter of the movie.
Yes.
And so when I went and started looking into the story, one of the first conversations I had was with a man called Rod Beatty, who knows an enormous about this and has set up a museum in Kanchanaburi. And the first thing he said to me was, there was no bridge over the River Kwai. In fact, there's no River Kwai. And so I thought,
how bizarre.
This is interesting. So clearly there's much more to this story than the fact that there isn't a bridge over. In fact, this is the interesting thing. There are 688 bridges, or were, on the railway line, and not a single one of them went over the River Kwai.
Wow.
So that got me thinking, I want to find out more about this story. And
so did you just sort of go to Kanchanaburi and say, okay, well, we're here, let's go and do a bit of a, tourism and find out what's going on? Or was it a conscious decision to say, okay, I'm going to do something about the Death Railway. I want to do a project about it.
It was a conscious decision. So I visited it on my own, went away, I did some reading, And then I contacted people in Canterbury and said I was coming back with a microphone. I was new to all of this, so I was making mistakes along the way. Recordings didn't work, interviews lost.
Been there, done
Yes,
that.
you'll understand that. However, I think people were very generous with their time, and as I went on the journey, in fact, I didn't start in Canterbury the second time round. What I actually did is I started all the way down in Singapore.
Right, which is where the railway start. It's like the start of the railway, isn't
No,
it?
it's not the start of the railway. The reason I started in Singapore was because all the soldiers, the British and Australian soldiers who worked on there, we'll talk more about other people who worked on the railway as well.
Oh, they were
the ones
POWs in Changi,
exactly.
right?
They
okay.
were exactly. So they had surrendered when Singapore fell in 1942. They therefore were transported from Singapore as POWs all the way up to Thailand. It was a 5-day journey
Right.
in trains and sort of cattle trucks, effectively. A horrendous journey in these steel. Imagine being in a steel carriage for 5 days with about 30 other men. You can imagine the smell. It would be appalling.
Yeah. We mentioned earlier on that you started your journey in Singapore.
Yes.
Because most of the POWs who built the railway started their journey there, but there were other people involved as well.
Yes.
But let's just say, where did you go after Singapore? So from Singapore and then onwards.
I went by rail overland through Malaysia, and I stopped off in Malaysia because I wanted to speak to a man who knows a lot about a large group of people who also built this railway. So we always think about it as POWs on the Death Railway, but there was only about 60,000. That's a lot, I know, but there were 60,000 POWs. As well as them, there were, and really the numbers are impossible to know, but maybe 250,000 Asian labourers.
Can you clarify for me what was the purpose of the railway? What the Japanese occupiers at the time wanted to create a route. I'm not really that familiar with how it works. So what was the purpose of the railway?
Very good. It's a good question. The purpose was to have a direct railway line between essentially Bangkok and Burma, because the Japanese army was in Burma and they were fighting a front in Burma and also possibly going to invade India. What they were doing before the railway line was that they were having to sail ships all the way down around the Malacca Straits,
Right.
Singapore, and all the way back around. And all that time, those ships were being sunk in large numbers by American submarines and the British Royal Navy.
Right. So it just obviously made sense to have a more direct route across land.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
I'm with you.
And that was really important for them to get it done as quickly as possible, which is why it's such a tragic event, because in order to build a railway as quickly as they did, and it took them about a year,
Right.
with slave labourers using pickaxes, shovels, tools,
And probably their bare hands in some cases.
and their bare hands. If you're going to do it that quickly, then you just really have no care about the life and the health of the people who are building that
And there's going to
railway.
be a lot of casualties as well.
Huge amount.
Please continue. Where were we? We were talking about the vast quantity of
Yes.
additional manpower that was required to build the railway. You had
Yeah.
60,000 POWs,
Yeah.
and you said nearly 250,000 people in total. So about 180, 190,000,
Yeah.
presumably Asian labourers.
Absolutely.
And they were mostly from where? Or just all over?
All over, but their story is really not known at all, and I think that was one of the fascinating things for me, was finding out about their story. One thing is, it's impossible to know how many of them actually worked on there. Some figures say 100,000, some say 200,000, some say up to 500,000.
Wow.
My guess would probably be about 250,000, but that's just a guess. Where do they come from? They don't actually come from Thailand, and I think people might think that they come from Thailand, and the reason that they don't is that the Thais were essentially forced by the Japanese to sign a treaty.
Right.
So you're not going to treat your allies in this way. So the Thais did some of the initial work, but after that it was forced labour.
Right.
So that forced labour was from countries that they had invaded, which were colonial countries. So we have Burma, we have Malaya, we have the Dutch East Indies. So that's where most of these people come from. Initially, some of them volunteered to work on the railway because...
That wasn't a smart move, was it?
It wasn't a smart move. No, they worked on plantations, say, in Malaya, and because the plantation managers, the British plantation managers had run away or been interned by the Japanese, they now needed work.
Right.
So they were told by the Japanese, well, we'll give you a job.
Come and help us, we'll feed you, we'll water you. Wow.
And once news got out about the conditions on the railway, people no longer volunteered, obviously.
Yes.
And so then we had people forced to work on the railway. And the Japanese used some quite cunning tactics. For example, one thing we know that they did in Malaya is that they would put on free films in cinemas. Then they would shut the cinema doors.
Wow.
And then as people left, any young men who came out of those doors were then forced to go onto trucks and put onto trains and sent up to work on the railway line. I met 2 people from Malaya who were forced to work there. One of them was 15 at the time.
Wow.
And unbelievably, the other one was an 8-year-old boy.
Good God.
And I met him a few months ago. He went up with his father, his uncle, and his grandfather, and only 2 of them survived.
Wow. We were talking about how many people were forced into labour to build this railway. And you said it took about a year or so.
Yes.
So they must have really been going for it if they went all the way from Singapore right the way up to the Burmese border.
Well, no, the railway from Singapore to Thailand was already built.
I see.
So we're talking about essentially Ban Pong to Thambuziet in Burma.
Right.
So that's about 415 kilometres. But even if you're...
Still a long way.
It's still a very long way. If you're from the UK, that's London, Paddington to Penzance. That is a long way.
That is a long way, yes.
Yeah. And they think that for every sleeper laid on the railway, somebody died.
Wow.
So next time you're back in the UK and you're going all the way down to Cornwall on the railway, we'll think about that.
Yes.
That's an extraordinary statistic. So you're right. And they also, because they were so keen to get it completed on time, the Japanese had what they called a speedo period, which meant they forced the labourers to work harder and longer hours. So sometimes they would be working as long as 12, 14, 16, or even 18 hours a day.
Wow.
To get this completed on time. Now, of course, at the same time, they weren't properly fed. And so this is how the death rate, and that's why it's called the death railway, was so high. Of the 60,000 POWs, about 12,000 died. And we reckon with the Asian labourers, the death rate was even higher, about 50%.
Wow.
So many of the deaths were due to malnutrition and the type of diseases you get through malnutrition.
Right, so dysentery and stuff like that obviously must have been rife.
Dysentery was possibly the biggest killer, yes.
Right.
There were outbreaks of cholera as well, which is a terrible disease. I don't even want to... listen to the podcast.
Yeah.
I don't want to ruin people's breakfast by talking about cholera right now. There's beriberi. I talk about all of these diseases that people got.
All right, well, so we've got the history of the project itself. When we come back after the break, let's talk about your journey making the actual podcast and doing the recordings and the interviews and so on. So we've kind of covered most of the historical aspects of the railway itself. You mentioned earlier on that there is in fact no bridge over the River Kwai, which is one of those little trivial things that we shall throw in a little bit later on. But let's take a moment to consider the actual project itself. Did you decide, I'm going to do some recordings and I'm going to create a podcast, or did it kind of happen organically? You thought, there's a really interesting story here. I have a bit of a production background, or not, as the case may be, and I'm going to do something to broadcast this story. Was it because this story affected you so much that you thought you should do something about it?
It was organic. I think when I realised that point, as you say, that there was no bridge over the River Kwai, in fact there was no River Kwai, I thought, this is interesting. So it was organic. And then I thought, what's the best way of telling this story? And I thought, I could write a book, but I'm not sure if I had that in me. and I liked the idea of doing a podcast. I really enjoy podcasts. I love listening to people on the radio like yourself, or other podcasts on history. I think it's a medium that people are really enjoying at the moment. Yes. When you go for a walk, when you're driving in your car, you can listen to stories.
It's kind of now, isn't it?
It's very now. So I thought podcast was the perfect medium. So then I with some very rudimentary recording devices, I went to see people and asked them, can I record conversation talking about this with you? And people were very generous with their time. So I talked to people at the Thai Burma Railway Centre in Kanchanaburi, Rod Beattie and his colleague Andrew Snow, who are incredibly knowledgeable. I talked to a man called Chandra Sekaran, who is the head of a group called the Death Railway Interest Group, and he's the man who's really doing a lot to make people aware of the Asian labourers and what happened to them. And he has a campaign for a permanent memorial for those Asian labourers, which I talk about in the podcast.
And there isn't one at present, presumably.
Well, spoiler alert, there wasn't at the beginning of the podcast.
Right. Well, that's great then. So
yes.
You've actually done some good out of.
I can't take any credit for it at all. That was all Chandra's work.
But I was to raise awareness. I think it's a very important thing.
I was lucky that I was with him, and I was there when they had the opening ceremony, and I spoke to survivors there. So that was a really, for me, that was a really beautiful part of the end of my journey.
Right.
Because it ended with that closure of being at a ceremony for a permanent memorial for the Asian labourers. So that was great.
Well, so obviously the fruits of your labour have borne something good. We talked before the news about your decision to create a podcast being organic. Yeah. Now, I've listened to, in fact, most of it. I haven't listened to all of it yet. I still have the last 2 episodes to look forward to, which I shall listen to definitely when I get home. I noticed that you've got some very good sound effects and so on in there. Did you do the production like you would do, did you approach it like a sort of a BBC production? You recorded the sound effects separately and kept them on the side, and then did the interviews and things and added the sound effects later? Or did you just go in with microphones blazing and whatever it was that you picked up was what you recorded?
Yeah, I spoke to a friend who'd worked in radio, and he said it would be a good idea to just record sound when you're on location, and it was a really good tip.
Yes.
So I record trains coming into stations when I'm in stations. I record birds in fields, and I think that really adds to the soundscape, so that when you're listening to it, you feel as though you're on location with me.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, for somebody who doesn't necessarily have that much broadcast or recording experience, it's incredibly well put together. It sounds like a BBC podcast, I have to say. And I'm not just trying to be over-complimentary, but it's very well put together.
Well, thank you. I did get help with some of the sound and the editing. So a friend of a friend who works in broadcasting, and I got help with them, and obviously paid them to help me. But yes, going around and recording sound for me was, again, we talked about podcasts and the medium of podcasts, and so I thought, okay, well, if I'm going to use that medium, then sound is important.
Obviously, yes.
And
how did you do interviews? Did you have equipment? And because obviously there is a tendency for those who are not perhaps as familiar with the gear as the rest of us, let's say, to have a microphone in front of somebody's face and then kind of drop it as the conversation continues.
Yes.
Were you aware of things like that? Were you coached in that area?
I learnt as I went along, and as I said, one of my interviews, I didn't hit the record button.
Oh no!
Luckily, and I won't tell you who the person is, but it was probably the least decent interview I did anyway, so it didn't matter too much.
For sure, we're live at the Siam Bakery. Our guest today is Nick Fordham, who's done a fascinating podcast on the Death Railway. Now, Nick, we were talking before that last tune about your journey in terms of the production. So you got everything produced and everything, but you did meet some very interesting people, and you learned some trivia about the bridge on the River Kwai, or over the River Kwai. Yeah. We mentioned earlier on that there isn't one.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about what else you found.
When you go to Kanchanaburi, there is a bridge there, and obviously the Thai Tourist Board will tell you that that's the bridge on the River Kwai.
Right.
So if we take a step back, why is it not the bridge on the River Kwai? Well, first of all, the bridge on the River Kwai is the film is based on a book written by a Frenchman who was never on the railway.
Right.
He was in French Indochina during the war, and he heard about the Death Railway, and he thought it would be a perfect setting for a book, which was then made into a film. Interesting. Here's another interesting bit of trivia. Pierre Boulle was his name. Not only did he write the book that was then made into The Bridge on the River Kwai, he also wrote the book was then made into a Planet of the Apes. So two of his books were made into very, very different films.
Absolutely. But Alec Guinness could have been in both of them, in fact, but he turned down a role in Planet of the Apes. A bit of film trivia for you. There you go.
So let's talk about Alec Guinness. So his role in the film is this colonel who's a very strange, sort of stuffy colonel who wants to prove to the Japanese that the British are better than them by building an even better bridge than the Japanese could do themselves.
Right.
That's the premise of the story. Now, the bridge that you visit in Kanchanaburi was also built by a colonel, a British colonel, and his name was Colonel Toosey. And when the film came out, a lot of people who knew Colonel Toosey were very upset on his behalf because they felt that this might be a slur on his reputation, and that maybe he had collaborated with the Japanese to make a great bridge, which was far from the truth. And I spoke to and had a very interesting conversation, a lot of it is on the podcast, with his daughter.
Right.
Sorry, granddaughter, Judy
Right.
Summers. She's written a book about him. And he was a very, very fascinating man, completely different to the Alec Guinness character. But, of course, they were in a very difficult position because they couldn't refuse to build the bridge on the railway. They had to do it. And they had to sort of get concessions from the Japanese. Like, he said, well, if we do, can we have rest days, for example? Can we get some more food? And the very other interesting thing is he established a relationship with a Thai merchant in Kanchanaburi, a man called Boon Pong. Now, Boon Pong's really interesting. He owned a grocery store in Kanchanaburi, and he was tasked with supplying the camps around Kanchanaburi with food and other supplies. Now, he realized that the prisoners were in desperate conditions and needed much, much more food than the Japanese were buying for them. So that with people like Colonel Toosey, he secretly smuggled in medicine, money, and food, and consequently, this Thai merchant saved thousands and thousands of lives, and I think he should be better known because of that. He's almost like a Thai Oscar Schindler. Here is a man who saved thousands of lives by secretly smuggling in vast amounts of money and medicine and food for the prisoners and the Asian labourers.
Well, is it Colonel Toosey?
Colonel Toosey, yes.
And his influence on some of the people that survived, some of the prisoners of war and the Asian workers that survived. You met with his granddaughter.
I spoke to her online, actually, because she lives in the UK, but she's written a book about him, and she was very, very interesting to talk to, and it was very interesting to hear so much about this man who had built that bridge that people go and visit in Kanchanaburi. And
how much of it is still left? The railway and the bridges and so on. Is there much left?
So, of the 415 kilometres, I would say about 100 are left. So, about a quarter of it is left.
Right.
And
is it being preserved, or is it kind of falling to bits?
Well, interestingly, the British forced the Thai to buy the railway off them at the end of the war.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They sort of said, listen, this is all your fault, which is a bit unfair, so you're going to have to buy it off us. And if you go to the area on the border between Thailand and Burma, or Myanmar as it's now called, this is quite rural, there's jungle, so upkeeping a railway line in that area would be very, very difficult. Around Kanchanaburi, it's flat, it's easy. So essentially they've kept the area about 100 kilometres around Kanchanaburi.
Right.
And after that it no longer exists. And really they stopped using it almost as soon as the war was over. And I think that's one of the great tragedies, is that 100,000 people, possibly more, died
To make
building
it, yeah.
a railway that was then only used for a few months. I mean,
Indeed.
and so it was quite moving to be walking through fields and through woods and know that 80 years ago people had built this railway line, and now there was no evidence that it exists anymore. Nothing.
Frightening. How long did it take you to create the podcast? And be honest, because if you're a fairly newbie, it must have taken you a while.
It did. I mean, I had the idea well over a year ago, so I was reading about it and dancing around it. But I think the actual, the journey I took over Easter, and then I wrote the scripts, and then I edited it, and then I edited it some more, and then I wrote some more scripts. So that whole process was about 4 or 5 months.
Right.
And I did go a little crazy sometimes.
I'm sure. How many individual chapters are there, for want of a better expression?
So there's 6 episodes,
Right.
and each
They're
of them
called
is
episodes.
about.
Okay,
I'm
sorry.
going to call them episodes. I don't know. What do you call a? I think it's an episode, and each one is about 45 minutes long. And thematic.
Except the last one.
Yes, the last one is a little bit longer, and I do hope that people stay with it till the end, because there's some really fascinating revelations and just bringing it all together. And I haven't revealed everything about the last episode,
No.
so I think it's well worth sticking to the end. But each one has a slightly different theme. So one of them I talk a lot about Singapore and Changi Prison, and you mentioned Changi Prison. And then in another one I talk a lot about the doctors and the diseases, and how I think the doctors who were on the railway were some of the real heroes of this extraordinary episode.
So, if our dear listener would like to listen to your podcast, and we highly recommend that you do have a listen, once you've listened to one episode, you will want to listen to the next, and the next, and the next, and there are 6 episodes. How do they do it?
I think the phrase is like wherever you listen to your podcasts, but you can do 2 things. Well, you could go to my website, and then there's links to the podcast there. So that is deathrailwayrevisited.com.
Right.
And if you go on that, deathrailwayrevisited.com, there are links. And also, actually, it's worth going onto the website, because I've got a map of the railway and some photos that I took.
Oh, so
and also some black and white photos of the time as
So
well.
that will actually give you like a sort of an illustrated guide to what you're listening to.
Exactly. So it's worth having a look at, and you get a sense of because when I'm visiting these stations, you can now see where they are on that map.
Right. So that's deathrailwayrevisited.com.
Yes.
Okay. And you were about to mention another way that our listeners can listen to you?
Well, the obvious one is where you listen to podcasts like Spotify. So if you go onto
Right.
Spotify,
And you look for Death Railway Revisited.
Death Railway Revisited, yes,
Right.
and you will find it there.
Fascinating. I'm going to throw you a quick question before we finish. Are you going to make another one about something else? Have you got the bug?
I think, do you remember Steve Redgrave, the famous Olympic rower?
Yes.
And after winning an Olympic gold, he said if you ever see me in a boat, feel free to shoot me. I'll never want to do this ever again. I think I felt a little bit like that when I'd finally completed this, but a few weeks later, I'm already thinking about what the next story might be. And I think it will be a story. I'm not going to say exactly what the story is, but I think it's going to remain in Southeast Asia. I think there's lots of stories here that I think people need to know and should know more about. So I have an idea to revisit another story in Southeast Asia.
Fantastic. Nick Fordham, thank you very much indeed. It's deathrailwayrevisited.com.
Yes.
If you'd like to listen to Nick's podcast. It's been a pleasure to chat with you. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Andy. It's been great. One of my interviews, I didn't hit the record button.
Oh no.
Luckily, and I won't tell you who the person is, but it was probably the least decent interview I did anyway, so it didn't matter too much.
Been there, done that. I
Yeah.
did that with a very, very good interview that I did with the members of the band Wet, Wet, Wet back in 1987. I recorded this interview. At the end of it, they said to me, "That's the best interview we've ever done," and I hadn't actually recorded it. Anyway, so it's an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
For some strange reason, we're not recording. Sorry, I do apologise. Talking of which, for some reason, it's not recording. That's how bizarre.
And that was the best bit of the interview, wasn't it?
Oh.